Welcome everyone today to this podcast of Middle East Insights platform. And my name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary. And today we are very thankful for the very rare privilege of Professor Mark N Katz with us, who is going to speak about what is the policy of Russia in Middle East. Now, that is something which is very interesting because most of the discourses are about US. But what is Russia right now doing? There's so many investments that are happening beyond the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. For example, Putin recently contacted Saudi Arabia so that to get the permission to arm the Houthi rebels, actually, just 1 or 2 days back. Russia is too much involved in making the first nuclear plant for Jordan. Heavy infrastructure, military exports with Iran, Syria. It has its own port of Tartus in Syria and many others. At the same time, with Israel, it is involved with artificial intelligence, technology, and surveillance. So, with every country, specifically Egypt, Turkey, Israel, UAE, Russia is involved in artificial intelligence. With all these countries in Middle East or West Asia, Russia is playing a very pivotal role and behind the shadows, and no one is really talking about it. So today is a very important initiative by MEI platform to talk about what is not often talked about. So with this, I would like to invite MEI volunteer Fayaz to introduce our speaker, and then Fayaz, welcome.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Before we begin, I would like to give a slight and a brief introduction of our platform, which is Middle East Insights platform. It is an honor and privilege to actually introducing our platform. It's a pioneering platform driven by passionate volunteers like me, dedicated to deepening our understanding of the Middle East and West Asia from the point of view of India, with a mission to bridge the gap between academic research and practical policy making. So MEI fosters, insightful research, dynamic dialogue, and equip future leaders to tackle the region's most complex challenges. And all kudos and thanks to Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, ma'am, for having us on this platform. And without wasting much of my time and your time as well, I would like to now begin with introducing the speaker of our today's event, which is Dr. Mark N Katz. So we are honored to welcome Dr. Mark, a distinguished non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East program and a professor of government and politics at George Mason University's Carr School of Policy and Government. Regarding the academic background of Sir, Dr. Katz was born and raised in Riverside, California, and he holds a BA International Relations degree from the University of California, Riverside in the year 1976, and an MA from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies 1978, and a PhD in political science from MIT in the year 1982. And mentioning about the notable early career of Sir. Before joining the academia, he served as a research fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he was an analyst at the United States Department of State and a Rockefeller Foundation International Relations Fellow. And his academic expertise spans around Soviet affairs and international relations, reinforced through his fellowship at Kennan Institute, United States Institute of Peace, USIP, and numerous other research grants he's been accolades with. And regarding if we mention specifically, and I was really flattered to actually see the teaching and fellowship experience of Dr. Katz, and he as he began his teaching at George Mason University in 1988, he's also had prestigious visiting scholar positions at institutions like the King Faisal Center for Research in Riyadh, Hokkaido University in Japan, and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And his leadership and scholarships are internationally recognized, from Washington, D.C. to the Arab Gulf States Institute and the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, where he has served on the Scientific Advisory Council since 2018. Talking about Sir's international contributions, recently in 2018, Dr. Katz was a Fulbright scholar at SOAS in the UK, and later he was honored as the Sir William Lewis Fellow at Durham University, showcasing his deep commitment to advancing knowledge on global affairs, particularly in the Middle East and Russia. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Shubda Chaudhary, ma'am.
Who is speaking right now is Fayaz Mehendi. And he's one of the very confident, courageous volunteers that we have. And he is always bubbling with energy and one of the really reliant volunteers that we have. So thank you, Fayaz, for your very in-depth introduction and for the privilege of your time for working out and researching on Professor Katz, because it's not easy. There's so many things to mention in it, so it's not easy.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
So
ma'am.
with this, Professor Katz, we'd like to welcome you.
So anyway, it's a great honor to be invited to speak to this forum. I really appreciate it, and I think what you're doing is really very important. I think it's very important that different countries develop their own expertise on different regions of the world. And you shouldn't have to rely, just on either Western scholarship or Russian scholarship or whatever. So I think it's really important that you're undertaking this initiative. So anyway, I'm here to talk about Russia's role in the Middle East, something I've been studying for about 45 years now. So it's been quite a long time. And just to begin with, just to talk about, what are Russia's strategies and aims in the region. And I think what's very important to note that one of the very first things that they want to do or have sought to do is to prevent Middle East and North African actors from supporting Muslim opposition forces inside the Soviet Union. Russia was, like many other European states, a colonial empire. The difference was that its empire was one over land instead of overseas, but an empire, nevertheless, it really was. And Tsarist Russia came to control large areas of, predominantly Muslim peoples. And essentially, under the Soviet Union, sort of despite the propaganda of all groups being equal, that very early on, what the new Soviet state sought to do was to maintain as much of the Russian Empire under their control as they could, and they largely succeeded at this. But it was never easy. In other words, that they faced opposition within Central Asia in the 20s and 30s, and then of course there was the fiasco of their intervention in Afghanistan. Everyone who intervenes in Afghanistan fails. Britain, Russia, the United States, no one seems to ever succeed. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union, basically, a lot of Muslim opposition feeling arose, and we saw the move for independence in Chechnya. Now, Chechnya, just a little place. You wonder, why not just let it go? But the trouble is that if you let one of these places go, I think for the Russians, then this opens the door for all of them leaving. And this was something that they don't want. And what they wanted in particular was to make sure that Muslim governments, Muslim opposition movements in the Middle East itself didn't connect with these people. And there was some connection in the 1990s, but this is something that in other words, this is something that they worry about. Of course, another goal that the Russians have had has been to forestall what Moscow sees as American efforts to minimize or exclude Russia's role in the Middle East. And so obviously Moscow and Washington have been competitors in this region. And certainly, at the end of the Cold War, with the general retreat of Russia, they didn't have many allies there. Sort of the one one that they ended up with in the Arab world was Syria. But so in other words, they wanted to stay in the Middle East. In other words, without a presence in the Middle East, then this brings into the question of, is Russia any longer a great power? And this is not a question that they want to have raised. So there is that. They have sought to advance their aims by taking advantage of Middle Eastern disagreements with and grievances toward America and the West. And obviously, the issue of Palestine in particular has been at the fore of this. But there's been lots of others as well. And so, in other words, the fact that that the West and the Middle East are at odds over different issues, this has given Russia, among others, an opportunity. And what's interesting is that under Putin, what they have sought to do is to have good relations with all major actors in the Middle East, including every government and every so-called national movement, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, Fatah in Palestine. In other words, everyone but the jihadists, in other words, the international jihadists, they have sought. This is different from under the Soviet Union, when Moscow was largely aligned with the revolutionary states and movements, and the U.S. aligned with the status quo powers. What's fascinating is under Putin, they now have good relations with everyone, including each and every traditional U.S. partner in the Middle East. And I'll just move on here. Wow, I'm just so unused to. Okay. All right. What else do they want to do? They have sought to make economic gains via exports to the region, investments to the region and from the region, oil cooperation with Middle Eastern states. So, what does Russia export? They export arms, they export atomic energy reactors, they export grain, wheat and other agricultural products. So these are the things that they have mainly exported. Now, of course, the Middle East also exports oil, and for quite a long time, Russia was at odds with the main players in OPEC, because the way that OPEC works is that the members that they seek to affect the price of oil by agreeing to limit their own production and export. And the Russians were never willing to limit their exports up until 2016, when finally an agreement was reached between basically the Saudis and the Russians in the so-called OPEC plus format. That the Saudis and the Russians are the main oil exporters of this grouping, and except for spring of 2020, when the Russians basically decided to stop cooperating and that they could export more, and the Saudis taught them a lesson by flooding the market and bringing down the price of oil to even in some instances less than zero. Quite remarkable how this happened. And the Russians they've never crossed the Saudis again on this. But and we'll talk about, during the war, clearly with all the sanctions on Russia, Russia continues to export, but at a discount. And of course, this is not something that the Saudis are happy about, or other members of OPEC. Anyway, this is, but in addition to, this, they've definitely sought investments from and gotten investments from, whether it's the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris in particular. They do a lot of business with Turkey, as we should now call it, and hopefully I'll remember to do that. That they also, have economic interests in Iran. That this is something that they're pursuing. One of the things that they've also sought to do to gain influence is to exploit the region's many ongoing conflicts and rivalries, often by supporting opposing sides simultaneously. This is something that is not new to Putin. That the Russians have long done this. It's an old imperial policy, and basically the idea is to give. The opposing sides don't like it that the Russians are helping the other side, but they're not in a position to really do anything about it, because if they get upset or want to end relations, then the risk is that Russia helps the other side all the more. So by doing this, you give everyone an incentive to court Moscow, or so they hope. In other words, it's not about being liked. In other words, that it's a question of positioning themselves so that people really feel that they have no choice but to cooperate. They've also advanced a number of conflict resolution proposals. They typically are supposedly comprehensive proposals, meaning that they try to solve all problems at once and therefore end up essentially being too difficult to implement. They're not really meant as meaningful proposals, in my view, but as part of Moscow's effort to undermine American conflict resolution diplomacy, which is far more piecemeal. There is just, if you can resolve any small issue, do that, whether you can resolve the other ones or not. And this justifies Russia engaging with opposing sides and keeping Moscow in the game. So this has some of the ways they've sought to to have influence in the region. Now, the big issue, of course, now is what has been the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on Russia's bilateral relations in the region. Now, unsurprisingly, Moscow's main Middle Eastern allies, Iran and Syria, have been highly supportive of Russia's war against Ukraine. Iran has even been selling weapons to the Russians, including armed drones, which the Russians make use of in Ukraine. And this is really quite remarkable. In other words, up until this point, it was Russia that sold weapons to countries in the developing world. And now Russia is dependent on arms supplies from Iran, also from North Korea. This is a remarkable development indeed. But what I think is especially remarkable with regard to this war is that, it's not surprising that Moscow's main anti-Western allies support Russia, but that each and every one of America's traditional Middle Eastern partners have, for the most part, not joined the West in supporting Ukraine or sanctioning Russia, but have sought to preserve or even enhance their ties to Russia. Now, Turkey has supported Ukraine. They do sell weapons to Ukraine, but they have not sanctioned Russia. They continue to do a lot of business and cooperate with Russia. Quite remarkable for a NATO member. And there have been a combination of motives for these. Middle Eastern governments just don't see Ukraine as their problem. This is, a European issue. It doesn't affect them. So why should they do anything for this? Also, there's issue of resentment that the West seems more concerned about Ukraine than about Arabs, especially Palestinians, and certainly since the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, this is something that many in the Arab world have been very unhappy about. In other words, that the U.S. says that Russia has invaded Ukraine, but what about the Israelis invading the Gaza Strip? And how is it that the U.S. is supporting that invasion but resisting another one? So it seems unfair. But in addition to, shall we say, issues of principle, there's also just the desire to make money by helping Russia evade sanctions. That Russia's trade with the West, direct trade, has come to decline tremendously, but a lot of it continues via third countries. via Turkey, via the United Arab Emirates in particular. And so they're making money off of this. And so uh, that's what they're doing. There's also, I think, in the Middle East, a fear of offending Russia. In other words, especially if they think, as they did at the very beginning of the war, if Russia's going to win anyway, then why join the West in taking action against Russia when they're going to have to deal with a triumphant Russia? Now, that feeling seemed to have gone away as Russia didn't do too well, but I think it's come back. In other words, I think now with Russia seems to be making advances, even at tremendous cost in eastern Ukraine. I think that now more than ever, they just have no desire to offend Russia. But also, I think one of the motives for not helping the U.S. is that they actually fear. In other words, there's the possibility that Russia could win, and they don't want to be on the bad side of a triumphant Russia. But there's also a fear that Russia could lose. And what happens if Russia loses? And are they going to see the return of the American unipolar dominance? And this was not something that Middle Eastern countries or a lot of other countries were very happy about. They didn't like the American emphasis on democratization and human rights. In other words, that now these are not democratic governments. They don't observe human rights, and so any criticism on this issue they regard as a threat. And Russia definitely is not someone who criticizes them on these issues. Now, as the war continues, are Russia's relations with the Middle East likely to change? Now, one thing we've seen is that countries that have purchased Russian arms have become increasingly worried about the reliability of continued Russian arms supplies. And this is partly due to Russian production constraints, as well as Moscow's prioritizing its own needs. In other words, they're not going to export weapons that they want to use in Ukraine. And so the reliability of Russian arms exports to the Middle East, which buys a lot of arms, has come into the question. I actually had a doctoral student write a paper which was published looking at this and sort of talking about, just sort of on a nitty-gritty level, what weapon systems are no longer readily available from Russia anymore. Now, there are countries, concerned about Iran. There's that Russia has tried to portray itself as the balancer between Iran on the other hand, on the one side, and the Arab Gulf states, Saudis, Emiratis on the other. Even with Israel, in other words, that they may worry that as Russia becomes more dependent on Tehran for arms supplies, that this may result in Moscow becoming less able or willing to restrain Iranian behavior towards them. In other words, that part of the part of the reason why Middle East countries concerned about Iran seek good relations with Russia is the hope that somehow Russia will be able to constrain Iran to preserve its own relations with other Middle Eastern states. And so what they worry is that Russia might not be in a position to constrain Iran. Continuation of the war in Ukraine may result in Middle Eastern actors seeking to balance against the U.S. In other words, not if Russia is preoccupied, and obviously Ukraine is far more important to Russia than the Middle East is, then Russia is an insufficient power to balance against the U.S. And so should they turn to others, such as China, even India. I remember I was at I think it was in 2011 that I went to a Saudi foreign ministry conference, about the changing international order. And what became very clear was that what the Saudis want, and I think other Arab governments, is they want other great powers to be interested in their region. In other words, that the more great powers that are interested, then the more efforts that they have to balance among them, to weave between them. And they were very disappointed because there were high-level representatives both from China and India who made it clear that they weren't interested in playing this game. But the Arab states can always hope. And I think that now, certainly with regard to China, they're seeing there is a greater Chinese role in the region. And basically, they want this essentially. So that's one of the risks that Russia runs from this war continuing. What does Russia offer to Middle Eastern countries, and how likely are they to be receptive to Russian offers? I mean, the great thing for the Middle East is that Russia offered arms supplies without any of the restrictions that Western countries impose on these. Middle Eastern countries have welcomed this, but as I mentioned, cannot be sure of how reliable a supplier Russia can be so long as the war continues. The continuation of the war offers economic opportunities from helping Russia to evade Western sanctions. These will continue as long as the war continues, and as long as America and the West are unwilling or unable to take serious action against its Middle Eastern partners for doing so. And I think there's, the Western governments are in fact a silent partner to Middle Eastern countries and any country that continues to trade with Russia. In other words, that the West doesn't want to harm its relations with those countries that do trade with Russia, and so it imposes some sanctions, but not to the extent that it could. The continuation of the war also, I think, is an insurance against U.S. unilateralism, or what people see it as. So long as the U.S. is worried about its Middle Eastern partners turning to Russia, Washington is less likely to push the democracy and human rights agendas that its Middle Eastern partners do not welcome. That's what they really hated about the unipolar moment. That if and during the Cold War and now, there are great powers that were worried about operating in the Middle East. When we weren't interested in that, then that's when we pushed democracy and human rights. So they don't want to see that return. Russia also provides diplomatic maneuver room. Unlike the US-dominated Cold War world order, the Middle Eastern actors see external great power competition as providing them with greater opportunities to exploit and freedom to act, as I mentioned before. So
my first question to you, sir, is, in fact, I have two questions, and this is something which I didn't understand really, was the Robert Mueller investigation of Trump and the Russian connection of it, and what happened to that entire investigation. Was Russia involved or not? And with US elections coming over in November, and Trump 2.0 being ready for it, how do you perceive that this changing dynamics? The Putin continues, but there will be a power shift. I heard today Biden's son was he was found guilty, or he was in the process of being arrested of his investments.
He pleaded guilty.
Pleaded guilty, yes.
Yes, so he avoids a trial. Yeah.
In short, how do you see that US elections, or the change of it, would impact Russia's policies in the Middle East?
Well, that's a good question. And, I think that, obviously in 2016, the Russians, they didn't want to see Hillary Clinton. They tried to weaken her. I don't think that they expected Donald Trump to win. I don't think Donald Trump expected to win. But Trump had made a point of how he got along with Putin, and he was, he could work with him. But it didn't take long after he came to office. In fact, I was in Moscow in mid-February 2017 at a one of their Valdai conferences, and already the joke among the Russians was Putin wants his money back. In other words, Trump had already proved to be a disappointment, and that's the thing. In fact, I think it was just yesterday. Putin. Someone asked him, who did he favor in the upcoming American elections, and he said Kamala Harris. And there were two reasons. First, he likes her laugh. That she seemed like a happy person, so that obviously wasn't very serious. But second, this Trump guy imposed so many sanctions on Russia that he wasn't good for Russia. And I think there's a greater appreciation that Trump really wasn't good for Russia. In other words, that despite all the hopes and despite Trump's own statements, that in fact it wasn't very good for Russia, and that Trump is just so unpredictable. I think Putin prefers to be the one who's unpredictable. He doesn't want competition. And he's made comments, about how Biden was more predictable. That's what the Russians like. Now, is this at all serious? One could argue, well, if Putin endorses Harris, it's because he really wants to undermine her because no one's going to like a Putin endorsement. So it's very strange. I think the real issue, I think, is what will happen with American assistance to Ukraine. Now, if Harris is president, I think she'll continue to seek to provide American military assistance to Ukraine. Will Trump? It's just not clear. He has made statements that, he doesn't much like President Zelensky. On the other hand, he's also made statements to the effect that he would help Ukraine far more effectively than Biden has done. I think that what Trump does not want to see is Ukraine collapse on his watch. So he says he can solve it within 24 hours. I've got a feeling that that's a little ambitious. But if Putin doesn't go along with what Trump proposes, well, how's Trump going to react? I think he's going to be very angry, and he's going to double down on supporting Ukraine. So that I think is the main thing. Is Ukraine. In terms of the Middle East, I don't see. I just think that sort of the outcome of the war in Ukraine will have a big impact on how successfully Russia can operate in the Middle East. In other words, that if it wins, then it will do much better. On the other hand, if this leads to just increasing tensions in Europe, in other words, that Putin certainly before his intervention indicated that he had plans with regard to rolling back NATO from Eastern Europe. In other words, if he pursues that, then the U.S. and Russia are going to be focused on Europe, not the Middle East. If he, if it's a stalemate, it's. I think that the most important thing is, will Middle Eastern actors continue to be willing to work with Russia? And I think that they will. In other words, they're making money. They don't want sort of a clear winner between Russia and the U.S. They want to see competition. So that's my view on it.
No, that's very true. At the same time, you're correct when you say about Putin, who wants to be the unpredictable one, because he's so ambitious that I remember in his autobiography, one of them, he mentioned that when he was in 1989, posted in Dresden, in East Germany, he actually believed he could stop the collapse of the Berlin Wall if he was just there. And he could. But that it also, like all this, discourse now feels like the Netflix series of House of Cards. When Robin Wright was the female character, being the US president, was in that dramatic series, had different kinds of patriarchal surveillance, blackmailing issues faced on behalf of Russia and vice versa, more than the male counterpart. That's a very interesting, contemporary discourse that I see playing out if it happens, if US is ready for the first female president. My second question, sir, is that since 2017, China has been strongly working on the Belt and Road Initiative. And slowly, 150 countries have become partners of it through the Memorandum of Understanding. The only country in G7 which left out of it was Italy, because it was not making as much money in the exports when compared to France and Germany in the Chinese mainland. China and Russia have had strong diplomatic discourse growing up in the past few years. But too much academic highlighting of this kind of discourse, diplomatic alliance, is not really talked about. What is your perspective of the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese diplomacy, and the Russian diplomacy?
Right. Well, obviously the Russians have sort of focused on sort of security assistance as a means of expanding their influence. I mean, economics is a factor, but for the Chinese, it's economics is the main factor in expanding their influence, and pretty much everyone, trades with them. And it's very difficult to avoid.
Yeah.
Doing so. What I think is that certainly in the Middle East, China has huge trade relations. Russia is a competitor in selling oil. China buys oil. They like that in the Middle East, that China buys so much oil. And, I think China is more regarded as a partner. Also, China doesn't bother governments about democracy or human rights. I think that in a certain sense, the continued Russian-American conflict will redound to the benefit of China, that in the Middle East. Now, but what I also think is that, the geopolitical competition of the 21st century is probably going to be the one between China and India. The two most populous countries in the world, and they border each other. This is not a recipe for love and friendship. And I think that, just as we saw in the latter part of the 20th century, when there was a Cold War between the US and the USSR, I think that slowly but surely, I think that everything is going to revolve about where different states are on this. It's not a question about will India ally with the U.S. It's more like, will the U.S. ally with India? India really is a great power, but it still seems to think like a third world state, and it's not. In other words, you're different from all other, you're as different from other third world countries as China is. And I don't know that, I think not everyone in India has quite come to that realization of their own potential. But I think that this is coming. And I think that, it's sort of like you can look at sort of, the rise of the US in the late 19th and early 20th century. The U.S. really didn't want to get that involved in world affairs. It was kind of, even retreated from it after World War I. But once World War II occurred, then it was in. And I think India also will, avoid getting involved in far-flung conflicts for as long as it can, as will China. But at some point, your competition is going to drive you to play some role. There's just as during the Cold War, each and every conflict in the world had a Soviet-American dimension. I think that by the mid 21st century, each and every conflict in this world will have an India-China dimension as well. It's not a question that I want it to be this way or anything, but I think that's just where we're headed, and that includes relations with Europe. I think that especially if the Europeans see the U.S. as less reliable, and they don't seem to be willing to act themselves, they're going to turn to others. They fear Russia more than anyone, and they should. And so they're going to try to get somehow China to restrain Russia, or try to get India to restrain Russia, just like now, Middle Eastern states try to get Russia to restrain Iran. Well, how it works or what have you, it's not exactly clear, but it's both going to be a challenge and an opportunity, I think. And the trouble is, I think, for India, is if it doesn't play this role well, China probably will.
No, that's I agree with you in terms of, like, for example, our Prime Minister visited Poland, and there was this entire, Poland, Ukraine, when the entire discourse was to create some kind of peacekeeping agreement. At the same time, because of the US sanctions, India has had to cut down on oil import, which is of better quality than the Saudi or the Iraqi oil from Iran. But now they're going to trade in rupee. From the Russian oil and energy market, India and few of the states in South Asia have turned into laundry states. So that, because even if European Union has imposed a lot of sanctions on Russia, but through a mediator or third party, they're okay to get the Russian oil or energy. So that is the diplomacy of it. But I will, because we have the paucity of time, this one question, the first question is from Varisha, and the question is that despite Russia's significant role that is played in the Middle East, why does it seem that US still remains as, in a unipower world?
Well, I don't think the U.S. sees itself in a unipolar world.
Yeah.
I don't know, if others continue to see it. Certainly, Russian propaganda wants that perception. But I think certainly from from the American perspective, if it was really a unipolar world, why do we control so little of it somehow? In other words, that it's not a unipolar world, and it's not a bipolar world. It does seem to be a more multipolar world. So that's just where we are. And I think that this whole question of India buying Russian oil, like, oh, people, how terrible, terrible, but the EU will buy that oil, and the Americans are happy. In other words, it's like, okay, what we don't want is to have a lack of oil, because that would affect prices in our own countries. So we're better off, in other words, if India pays a low price for Russian oil and sells it on to Europe, in other words, India is getting the profit that Russia is not getting and would have gotten normally. That's fine. There is that we don't want to say it out loud, but we're happier. That's a less worse situation than buying directly from Russia. In other words, that it helps Russia, but not as much as Russia. Russia doesn't benefit as much as if it could sell this oil directly at regular market prices. So I think that's the thing. In other words, India has simply become too important for us to seriously sanction, or to, in other words, that, we can complain and whatever, but at the end of the day, I think that it's in not just US, but Western interests to agree to disagree with India on certain matters. And that's just how we're going to proceed.
Yes, that is true. No matter how much the diplomatic, optics keeps on the fiery exchange between against George Soros continues. Even India knows that US is a strong supporter of many of the aspects of trade and specifically diaspora-related growth for India. So
Yeah,
that is one thing which is
that is
very, very
interesting. Yeah.
interesting.
And in fact, that's a question I have to you. I'm just,
Yeah.
wondering, how is Kamala Harris regarded in India? I've seen articles recently that, you know, really a lot of Indians, they don't care much about her, but that there are some who like her. I mean, I just don't know. What I think it is interesting is just the success of the Indian diaspora community in the United States, and certainly when Prime Minister Modi came to the U.S., I mean, just thousands of Indian Americans turn out. They all love him.
Yeah.
So there is, and that's been true with America's relations with so many countries. In other words, that it's like the diaspora population plays a big role in the relationship. And for better or for worse. In other words, that part of the reason why America's relations with Iran are so bad is because Iranian Americans all hate the Islamic Republic. So that's something that it doesn't work in Iran's favor. But obviously, with regard to Indian American relations, there's now a lot of and more in the past. And I think certainly in terms of America's relations with Pakistan. In other words, that in the past, the U.S. focused more on Pakistan. They were more willing to cooperate. So there you go. But now I think that sensitivity toward India has just grown, just because people know Indian Americans, and they like them and whatever. So I just think that there's now a closer people to people relationship between India and the U.S. than between Pakistan and the U.S., for example.
That's true, sir. But I think that Kamala Harris is actually playing the Indian diaspora card when it suits her, because first, all the years of the vice presidency, there was no news about what she's doing or what is her role in foreign policy or domestic politics. It was not in the news. Suddenly, since Biden had to drop out and she was replaced, and she had to choose Tim Walz. She couldn't have won or even be nominated on the party ticket without having a white man. So Tim Walz was the best coach or partner for that. But the point is that she doesn't have very strong foreign policy experience, first. Second, she has been quite critical of Prime Minister Modi when he has been to US in a very subtle way. And the optics and theatrics of that is evident. So I don't know how many of Indian citizens are really concerned about Kamala Harris after looking at that kind of treatment, which was very subtle. It's only those in diplomacy who will understand it. But at the same time, at a larger, if we talk about India as one monolithic, homogeneous entity, which it is not, but at a larger level, her getting selected would mean a great deal for the Indian diaspora. But then, what did Rishi Sunak mean for the Indian diaspora in UK? If you draw the parallel, so it doesn't, it's always changing, it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
The status quo is very different. The next question
Yeah.
is from Anurag Khond, and his question is that, is Afghanistan a crucial area of cooperation between Russia and Middle East, given the shared conflicts? Just a second. Given the shared concerns of both regarding the spillover of instability and extremism from the region, also, the increasing contact between Moscow and Taliban regime could be utilized by Middle Eastern countries like UAE to have more outreach with Kabul and also to have with Moscow. So, in short, do you think that the Taliban takeover of
Well,
Afghanistan
you know,
will?
it's A very interesting question. I just think that yeah, the Taliban, in other words, it's now fallen into the category of a national movement. In other words, that it's, you know, unlike when it was in office in the 1990s, and it not only supported Al Qaeda but also the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which had, ambitions throughout Central Asia. That the Taliban now seem to be just concerned about oppressing Afghanistan. They don't need to export their their uh, their vision outside of the country, and that there is something worse than the Taliban. There is the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is a international list jihadist organization. And so I think that basically, Russia, Iran, China, um, have very pragmatically decided that the thing to do is to cooperate with Afghanistan. And I think that to some extent, obviously the UAE has done so, perhaps the Saudis to some extent as well. And, certainly there are even, voices in the United States, certainly our former Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, he who for Donald Trump made the agreement with the Taliban for U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think that he's also, talked about, the Taliban are now in power. They're the ones you have to deal with, and that I think there's a hope that, in other words, like, whatever they do in their own country is their business. What we just want is them to not do anything in anybody else's country. And I think that the Taliban seem to understand that that's in their interest. In other words, if they have any hope of getting any kind of money or investment, and they need these things, that they have to be, more cooperative. And so that, I think, is what's happening. I also think that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, people talk about it as being a great defeat. I think it's one of the smartest things we ever did, that we should never have gone there to begin with, because basically our presence there allowed Russia, Iran, China, even Pakistan to free ride. In other words, that they all have much more reason to fear the Taliban. And the American presence there basically fought their battles for them. The U.S. is now gone. Other people now have to deal with Afghanistan as best they can. That is their problem, the states that are closest to Afghanistan, not ours. And that's how it always should have been.
That is very true, because when Biden specifically announced the return of the troops, and I have met a couple of very young boys just out of school who were deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan. When Biden announced it, it was seen as a certain kind of defeat. But I said that A, he's being honest about it. B, he's seeing it in terms of rational business expenditure. C, he's seeing it also in the kind of post-traumatic stress disorder which is being caused in the American army. So there are so many layers of it. Instead of, the entire binary of looking at it as, okay, this was a victory and this is a defeat, the geopolitics doesn't run that course. Because every day, something happens. And right now, for example, who remembers what kind of hullabaloo was caused about when, Taliban took over? Right now, everyone is talking about how Taliban is illegally banning and creating more discourses on what women should wear and how women should present themselves. So that is something which is very interesting, because time moves very quickly in politics. And US did a very rational decision, and it was something which I respected Biden for doing it, honestly, because no other precedent.
And by the way, he was just implementing the deal that Donald Trump signed. In other words, it wasn't, he was just implementing Trump's agreement with the Taliban. In other words, that we would not have had a different result had Trump been president. If the U.S. troops were going to leave, then the Taliban was going to come to power. In other words, that the government we were supporting was so weak, so insecure, so lacking of self-confidence that basically they wouldn't fight themselves against the Taliban effectively. So, what business do we have of, of doing this? That's totally different from Ukraine, where Ukrainians are willing to fight in their own defense. And if that falls, then it'll be a much greater impact on America's position in the world. But I think with Afghanistan, just like with Indochina, we basically cut our losses. And look what happened with Vietnam. Tremendous defeat of the United States. Now we're like best friends. It's like, what was the war even about? That the U.S. and Vietnam seem to be, cooperating very closely. We both are worried about China, obviously. And I think that's what some people think, that in a certain point, the Taliban will become more of a sort of a more status quo regime themselves, and we'll see cooperation with others as in their interests.
That's true. That's actually, I can accept the fact that it was Trump's deal to a certain extent, with all the humor involved in it. But the last question that we have is, there are a couple of more questions. If you have time, I can just
Sure.
email it to you,
Okay.
and you can respond, and I'll get back to. These are asked by our volunteers, so I can immediately send it to them. The last question is that how will an increased Russian presence in Middle East affect India?
Well, I guess the assumption, of course, is that there will be an increased Russian presence in the Middle East. I'm not sure. In other words, I think that they're going to maintain a presence in the Middle East, that's for sure. But I'm not sure how it would increase. Well, maybe it's possible. Certainly, their presence in the Sahel has increased. But I think that I think that if sort of in a certain sense, in other words, that what's different about the Cold War is that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union supported revolutionary powers, revolution in general, whereas now Russia supports status quo governments. Of course, Iran's a revolutionary state, but it seems to be one that wants to operate through proxies. But Russia wants to have good relations with all the countries that Iran has bad relations with. So I think that in terms of India, I'm not sure how much they're focusing. Now, if the India-China competition increases, maybe India will see it as in its interest that Russia continues to play a role. I think that for a lot of Indians remember how during the Cold War that the Soviet Union and India were both concerned about China. That all of China's neighbors have been concerned about China at some point. Right now, almost all of them, except for North Korea, are concerned about China, except for Russia. I think that for a lot of Indians, they're waiting for Russia to return to its senses about China. That they remember how Russia was worried about China, and that it will there's the current good relationship between China and Russia is dependent on the Putin-Xi Jinping relationship, and they change either one, much less both, and the relationship could change dramatically. Certainly, a lot of Russians, back when I was able to go there, they anticipate this, that the current China has bad relations with almost all its neighbors, but good relations with Russia, that the norm is to have bad relations with China, and that by the 2030s, in other words, when Putin is out of office, they anticipate that China is going to be a lot more assertive when it comes to Russia. And I think China also is a winner no matter what happens in Ukraine, because Russia becomes more dependent on China under any circumstances, win or lose. And I think that Chinese school children are all taught, they're all shown these maps of the stolen territories that Russia took from China. And I think if you publicize something to such an extent, then you can't just let it go. There's that you can't just say, "Oh, they stole this from us, but now we're friends, and we're going to get along." I think that at some point, that when they have the chance, they will raise this issue.
No, that is true. But the nostalgia of any empire, which has become a nation state today, irrespective of its size, be it the Ottoman Empire, be it the Russian Empire, be it the British Empire or the French.
No,
Yes. And so the point is that for any empire, the nostalgia of the past and how it has permeated the textbooks to teach children about the lost lands and the glory to retake them.
And that includes the Chinese Empire.
Yeah, the Chinese Empire. So all of it, it is a certain kind of, so that is what E.H. Carr wrote, that what is history? What is taught to the children in their state textbooks? What is this history? Is it the truth? Or in his words, it's just something which is much more fluid. It's like a historian first framing the narrative and then finding out facts and having a dialogue to fit that history, which is not the past, but the present and the future. So with this, sir, I would like to really thank you for the privilege of your time. Every part of the analysis helped us a lot in thinking about the discourse in a different way. And something which I really, from my side, I want to thank you and I want to let others know is that the poster that you saw for the event, it was the teamwork between Professor and me. It was just not me designing it, but it was Professor and me working together on every detail of the font, of the size, everything. We were just continuously texting, like emailing each other and making. And he's been the first guest who has shown this much of interest. And a very simple thing was that my introduction was of 2 lines and his was 3 to 4 lines. And he said that, no, both of it should be equal. And that was something which carried a lot of empathy for me. And thank you so much, sir, because I cannot see myself as an equal, but at least you treated me like that. So thank you so much for the privilege of your time, sir.